So what is social structure? If you take enough sociology classes, you're going to find that that term shows up over and over and over again in textbooks, in readings, in class discussion. And yet that phrase, social structure, is not often well defined. Let's try to rectify that today. Let's talk about social structure and what it means. Social structure has two words in it, social and structure. Structure just means a pattern, an order, an organization. And the social is the matter of that organization and the mode of that organization, the mode it takes. So social structure we can define as a pattern of interaction, affiliation, organization, or domination that exists outside the individual and strongly shapes the fate of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, and whole societies. So when I say social structures exist outside the individual, you should notice that there is a foil here. In our Western societies, we tend to think of individuals. And individualism is the foil against which sociology is organized. Individualism is the idea that thoughts, intentions, hopes, desires, dreams all occur inside the individual, and then once they have been determined inside the individual, find their expression out in the world and affect that world. On the other hand, sociology reverses the arrow. It says the fate of individuals, the choices that individuals make, come from forces outside the individual. Sociology does a little bit more than that too. It says, actually, we need to start seeing things other than individuals and think about the fate not just of individuals, but of groups, of communities organized into areas, of societies, of institutions. So social structures don't just affect individuals, they also affect entire societies and all the smaller parts within a society that nonetheless are larger than an individual. Now, in sociology, there are different ways of thinking about what that structure might be. And that depends on the paradigm that you're working with. A paradigm is a way of seeing, a way of organizing a central image of social structure in order to say, this is really the kind of arrangement that matters, that affects the fate of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, and societies. These are arranged from small-scale sociological theories to large-scale sociological theories. In one of these paradigms, symbolic interactionism, SI for short, symbolic interactionism has to do with mostly individual people actually interacting in an environment in which those people share symbols, expectations with one another, and they also face expectations from higher order features like the general culture, media, and so on, that express meanings, but also expectations for behavior. And that individuals are surrounded by that kind of pressure and put that sort of pressure on one another. That's a social structure impinging on an individual and affecting their fate. A related but not identical paradigm, the network paradigm, supposes that there are really just a few sort of things in the world as well. Those things are groups of individuals who belong to a group, or ties between individuals that form a pattern, a structure. And it is that structure, something about the size of a group, for instance, or something about the centrality of one's location in a network, that determines the fate of the individuals or the subunits within that general social structure. Well, we can think about more than that. There's the big F in sociology, functionalism, that thinks about society as if it were a body. Now, I'm not an artist, but we could imagine that that's a person. And people have different organs, like the heart. They have the nervous system, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. They have skeletons and other organs. And those organs all have a function, a purpose. What is the purpose? The health and stability of the whole. Functionalism says we should look for organs of society that are like that, that promote the health and stability of society as a whole, not of the individual people that are part of it, but of the society as a whole. And what do we call those? We call those institutions. Institutions whose name describes their function. The educational institution, which consists of particular educational organizations like schools or universities, but the institution is the function, education. Healthcare. Now that might have hospitals, that might have clinics, it might have doctors' offices in it. It might have EMS units. Those are all organizational units, but they're part of an institution. What? The healthcare institution, the penal institution, which is where we put people when they aren't behaving well. Each of these works like organs in a larger body. They work together, they relate to each other in such a way that they promote the health and stability of a society. That's a kind of a social structure that affects the fate of the individual, because institutions are not about the well-being of people. To the extent that individual people can be invested in order to further the health and stability of society, that's great. But if it means that individuals have to be sacrificed to the imperatives, the functional imperatives of this system, so be it. Then finally, there is the big C, conflict. The conflict paradigm thinks about stratified positions of competing interests and an order of resources and power. So here, the image of social structure is one of layers. This is low and this is high. And the idea is that you can order these positions according to something that is important, something that is valued, status, power, resources, wealth. These three can go together. They sometimes do, they don't always. Privilege, that's part of status. And that there are spaces in this stratification system, this hierarchy, in which there's some things that are higher than others, some that have more power, and some that have less, some that have more status, some that have less. And that these are positions that people can occupy, not individual people, but positions. What those positions are depends on the kind of conflict theory you might be interested in. These might be occupations. Certain occupations are higher on the status order than others, and others are at the bottom. We might think of races. We might think of genders. There are all sorts of ways in which we differentiate according to status, wealth, and power. So, here's a social structure. Strata. Another social structure, institutions. A third social structure, networks. A fourth social structure, culture, media, interaction, and the symbolic expectations and meanings that are involved in those. Each of those is something that exists outside the individual and yet impacts the individual as well as these other units. It impacts groups, it impacts the fate of communities and societies as well. We can study any particular subject within one of these social structures. So for instance, if we were looking at gender, we might consider, if we take a simplified view of gender, that we have two people of different genders, and we might consider how that gender constitutes something called a master status that shapes all the other expectations that we have for that person and all the expectations that are pressed upon that person. And then we could look at all the different symbolic expressions associated with one group versus another. We could look at how individuals who occupy particular gender positions help to recreate those expectations as well. If we look at networks as a social structure, we can, carrying on the example of gender, think about gender there too. If we're thinking about groups, do we find that some groups have a majority of one gender while other groups have a majority of another? It's possible. What happens when those groups meet? Or how do they not meet? How are they separated? How are they segregated? How did that group structure come to be? If we're thinking about networks, do we find that networks are organized so that there are few contacts between groups in particular circumstances? Or are there situations in which that breaks down and it becomes more likely for individuals to interact across, in this case, gender groups? That is called homophily. Homo meaning same, phily meaning affinity for association. Homophily occurs when individuals in their networks are segregated according to statuses like gender. That's a social structure. Institutions like, the family. What does the family institution do? If you consider that the existence of any kind of regular pattern of organization can be thought of as an institution, then your next goal is to say, well, what does it do? Just like if you find an organ in the body, you need to figure out what's it for. Many people have indicated that the purpose of the family is reproduction. Reproduction of what? Of workers, these essential units for society, perhaps. Also reproduction of a certain order. That is, we learn how to be and how not to be inside a family. In fact, the very existence of gender in families, certain gendered forms like marriage can be thought of as functional if married units are supposed to create better reproduction of future units that we call children, these future units. children. But it can also be thought of as a thing that is to be reproduced itself. Marriage is reproduced in families through the teaching that marriage is a good thing, a thing to which individuals ought to aspire. So family can lead to the reproduction of itself if we're thinking of families of a particular sort. If you consider that families are a functional solution, if you're a functionalist and you believe in functional social structure, then it becomes a problem when marriages end up being on the decline. Finally, in stratification systems, we can think about how it is that some individuals end up on top, other individuals end up on the bottom, and yet other individuals end up occupying intermediate spots in wealth, status, and power. Now, I thought we were talking about gender, and yet I have 4 individuals here, 4 different colors representing 4 different positions. How is that possible? Well, it's possible if gender intersects with other forms of stratification, like gender and class, or gender and race. These are all different ways of thinking about stratification, institutions, networks, and social structures, media, culture, and socialization. All different ways of thinking about social structure. All different ways of thinking about something substantive you care about, like gender. If you want to understand social structures a little bit more, continue to practice the habit of, when encountering a subject, like work, or like gender, or work and gender, thinking about how a symbolic interactionist, a network analyst, a functionalist, or a conflict theorist would think about each of these. How would they draw it on the chalkboard?